We're going to go ahead and start on our fireside chat. This one's going to be a lot quicker than the other ones. This one hopefully is going to be a lot juicier than the other ones because we're taking something that, for better or for worse, has been controversial, and that's been a topic on Twitter in the recent days. So we invited a bunch of experts up here who know a lot about this stuff to kind of help us come to an understanding of what do we mean when we talk about Rollup finality. So if I could have your attention again, the recommendation is if you're talking in the back, to please go upstairs so that people who want to listen can hear the panel. And if you want to hear the panel, I would encourage you to come forward and grab a seat so you can be closer to hear us. Okay, cool. Before we get started, maybe let's do a quick round of intros, maybe like 10, 15 seconds, your name, and what do you work on?
Hi, my name is Mark, and I am a contributor to the Optimism Collective.
Nice and easy. My name is Kemi. I lead developer relations at Fuel Labs.
My name is Mas. I go by Rain and Coffee on Twitter. I work at a VC called Maven 11 out of Europe.
Hi, and I'm Daniel Helm. I lead developer relations at Scroll as zk Rollup.
Okay, cool. So can we just start maybe by going around the table, and can we just define what do we mean when we talk about finality? Maybe we don't have to define what it is, but let's just, for the audience, like when people say the word finality, what are they referring to exactly in the context of an L2, or of a rollup specifically?
Oh, good question. So the word finality always needs to be relative to something, right? Because we can talk about finality relative in terms of, say, like from the point of view of the user or from the point of view of the protocol. So really, finality is just about having some sort of certainty about truth, and that truth not changing.
Yeah, well, there's like different stages of finality as well. So you could say the first finality guarantee you get is the soft finality guarantee from the sequencer, for example. Then you get another one on the L2 after a state transition has been done, but it's still pending on the L1. So there's different stages as well, and you'll eventually get sort of a final finality in the case of an optimistic rollup after 7 days. In the case of a CKR, usually 3 to 10 hours, depending on the proving time and verification time as well.
Well, I think it's all solved. No controversies at all. We've got it covered. I think the confusion comes from, right, like we have this issue where we kind of all feel like we know what finality means on the L1, and then it gets weird when you start doing the rollups, right? And so I think there is this idea of like nothing can change. There's maybe this like very kind of specific protocol-specific styling where we can say maybe 7 days is the right window for this. Or in the ZK context, like we need a proof to prove that all of these transactions that have been made are valid and the transition state is now good. I think that's kind of the basics for what the finality is we have that idea and that sense of the L1 and what that means, but how can we make that work when now we have kind of two pieces of things that can be final, the L1 and the chain state, chain head on the L2, right?
Well, the thing about rollups is that they're supposed to inherit the security of L1, so shouldn't only the finality of L1 really matter?
I love that definition, actually. Yeah, I think that's true. I think if we're talking about finality and roll-up finality, we should be looking at the L1. That is guaranteeing the security of the entirety of the chain. And so, at that point, if we're going to inherit that security, we have to look at the L1 finality.
Yeah, but then the problem is currently there's just a single centralized sequencer. So you can't really say you're inheriting the security if you're also trusting a single sequencer, right? So then you kind of have to depend on the L1. But if there's some sort of consensus algorithm on the L2 in like a shared sort of sequencer network, you could use that as sort of a finality guarantee. But happy to hear your thoughts as well.
I'm not sure how related a leader election is to, say, finality, because finality is really about the execution on L2 not being reverted, not changing, right? And you get that property once that data is made available, and then you have, confirmations on top of that available data, right? Because we work with protocols that favor liveliness over safety, right? We have reorgs. So there's a cost to a reorg, right? And that is your security budget, right? So really it's about the data being made available and that data becoming canonical with having enough economic security on top of it so that it cannot be reorged out.
Cool. So from your perspective, data availability being finalized is the exact same thing as the rollup finality.
Yes.
Okay, so at that point, what happens if you have a bug in your sequencer?
Can you elaborate? Like what kind of bug?
A bug in the sequencer, or let's say you don't have any, a malicious actor comes in, commits something incorrect in that transaction or the new transaction state, so that such that the L1 official view is divergent from the L2 running view. The L1 fault-proof system there, the intention, right, is such that it can negotiate and make sure that everything ends up realigned, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So basically, there's no concept of a reorg in that case, right? Because there's basically users will make claims about their ability to withdraw, and the finality of the ordered set of transactions has nothing really to do with claims about withdrawals.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you have, sort of in the case of a sequence of failure, if you can still sort of exit withdrawal from the L1 where your funds are, you sort of still have safety in that regard. Like, so if you have a sequence of failure, for example, because we're talking about having a bug or having a failure, in the case of a sequence of failure, or you want to get your funds out of the L2, you can still have exit withdrawals. And I can prove to the L1 deposit contract that these are my funds, and I can get them out.
I'm just not quite sure exactly how that's going to run into the context of something that isn't part of that canonical final set on the L1 we're talking about, transactions happening on to L2, and then when those things are finalized, right? Just because the data is available and finalized on L1, we've got to wait that 7 days for us to be able to declare the state to be finalized, because that's how the bridge recognizes it's finalized to know if you can do that exit, right?
Yeah, but that's sort of a arbitrary sort of 7-day period. Couldn't you, in theory, let's say you wait 2 epochs where you have sort of a supermajority of votes from the L1 validators that the data is correct. There's time for the watchers to look at it. Can you, maybe good for you to elaborate on why is it 7 days exactly?
So the whole 7-day thing, it's partly a meme, but it's also partly there to ensure that there's time for layer 0 to step in and take action, right? Because with an optimistic rollup, the lack of a fault proof basically indicates truth. So the amount of time that a fault proof can be posted, we need to make sure that there's no censorship during that time, right? We need to make sure that it is profitable for someone to submit a fault proof within the fault proof window so that they can make money by securing the network.
So if the L1s or L0, as you said, block space is less congested, could we sort of agree on a lower number that's not 7 days, so we don't get sort of third-party bridge providers popping up and sort of taking on an inventory risk and a fee to sort of facilitate these instant swaps, out of the L2?
Yeah, I think that we could do that in theory. Maybe in the future, once our systems are running in production with, fault proofs have been really well tested for years. There's many implementations of fault proofs. But an interesting design space that I think is underexplored is basically a dynamic sized window based on how over collateralized the bond is, right? Because then if the bond is larger, you have a higher guarantee that a transaction that executes through the fault-proof game will be included because it's more profitable.
But that's also sort of a bigger risk for the sequencer as well, right? In case something goes wrong. And it's also a larger cost to become a sequencer, which could mean that you'll get a less decentralized sequencer set sort of eventually, right? So the cost to entering as a sequencer is higher, because the bond would be higher as well.
Yeah, but in an ideal optimistic rollup, it's permissionless for anyone to put down this bond and make a claim about what the L2 state is at a certain height.
Oh yeah, but if you heighten the bond of that, the amount of people that will permissionlessly enter is going to be lower as well.
Yeah, but there's like a minimum bond, right? In this design, there's a minimum bond, and the larger the bond is, like that it's over collateralized, the shorter the fault-proof window is.
Just to jump in, because I don't think like anyone here is objecting to the optimistic roll-up security model, right? I think the question though is, can you really, we have this harsh language around decentralization and these really high barriers to use certain words, right? It's important that we maintain those because we need that security and decentralization. If we start diluting those, we don't have things to work against anymore. And so finality is actually really important here because, excuse me, like you need that window for the security. And so I don't know how we can ever define finality as before that window being done, right?
So there is a way around this, right? Because finality is always relative to something, right? So relative to like the Platonic truth, it is final as soon as the transactions are made available with sufficient L1 economic finality. From the point of view of the user, that is not true. But we can build fast liquidity bridges on top of that, where basically liquidity providers can do off-chain client-side validation to ensure that the withdrawals that are being claimed are valid, and basically give the money to the user instantly on L1 and tell the user to withdraw to them and charge a little fee for opportunity cost time of money.
And you're probably going to have someone provide a lot of liquidity there, and they're putting their liquidity at risk because there's this 7-day period where there's the tiniest bit of chance you have a security issue, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, they are taking on the security risk, but that's why in the ideal future, there are multiple implementations of fault proofs running in parallel that basically give the same reason why there's multiple L1 clients, right, to prevent bugs from becoming consensus. There needs to be multiple fault-proof implementations all running in parallel. Otherwise, you're going to get the problem that you're talking about.
And that makes sense, and I love the design. I guess what I'm coming back to, though, is like, we have to have, we have to tell users when finality is, though, right? And it seems like we can have off-chain finality, right? And we can talk about that. We can have 2-3 second block times and say, this is probably going to be great for certain styles of things. But when you start pulling in billions of dollars, right, at a certain point we have to say this is finality, and you are trusting Ethereum for your security for this finality. And in the zk sense, we don't have to do that, right? We can do a validity proof. We have a zk prover that has mathematically kind of guaranteed that these transactions have done the zk EVM set, right, and they've done the transition state correctly. There might be bugs there as well. We have issues as well. But I think that's the idea, is like, we have a clear idea of finality. It's not when the data availability is final. It's when that proof is also finalized and isn't going to get reorged out of the canonical chain, right?
But in that situation, you're relying on sort of the proving time, the complexity of, and sort of the verification time of that as well. So you have sort of, at least now, you have a time period of like, with the Starknet sort of sharp verify on Ethereum, that's 3 to 10 hours till you actually get that finality, and that final proof gets posted. So isn't that like a long period where things could go wrong until it's actually finalized?
Absolutely, and that's why finality is such a harsh term, right? Like, we can get all the data on chain on the L1 for sure, and then if the proof takes 8 minutes to generate, if it takes 8 days to generate, it doesn't matter. Until that thing is on L1, the rollup's not finalized.
So I agree with you, but finality is always relative to something, right? So the ordering of the transactions in Scroll's case is final when they're made available on Ethereum. But from relative to the user, if the user wants to withdraw, they can't do anything until the validity proof, verifies. So we have to remember that finality is always relative to something.
Right, but I think we're interested in the bridge's perspective of what the L2 state is, right? The L2 is this off-chain protocol doing whatever. It could be an EVM, it could be fuel, but if we're saying that we're inheriting the L1 security through the bridge, we're not interested in relative to what. We're interested in the bridge, right? We need to know what the bridge thinks is the final state, because that allows users to withdraw their funds or not if they're using the trustless integration of the bridge. Otherwise, you have other things where people lock up money, and you have these other ways of doing fast withdrawals. But in terms of just kind of coming back to what this word means and the importance of it, we can talk about data availability finality, but I think for Rollup finality, it just really needs to be when after the challenge period or after the proof is, all the way done being finalized on the L1.
Yeah, so basically semantics are important, and the different stages of finality are also important. And I guess you can take different guarantees from different levels of finality. But at the end of the day, the actual finality won't be until much later, at least at this point.
Okay, so recently, Norswap on Twitter, who I think is part of the Optimism team, right? Optimism Collective, posted a tweet that said, a poll that said, when does a rollup reach finality? And the options for the poll were after sequencer confirms, after transaction batch reaches L1, after challenge period. And the answer that got the most votes was after challenge period, followed by after transaction batch reaches L1. And I think we just spent a bunch of time touching on these different perspectives and how, I like what you say when it's it's relative to something. Can you just quickly explain, very concretely, the people who think or who maybe voted after transaction batch reaches L1, in what context, if any, relative to something, is that correct? And then the other one, after challenge period, what context is that correct in? Because I think what we're all probably getting at here is that, and I mean the whole point of this panel is there really isn't a definition that's standard across the industry. It's something that is being worked out in real time. So I just would be interested for you guys to explain both of those answers, it seems like, have some perspective where they're correct. Could you just clearly define, in which ways is this one correct and in which ways is the other one correct?
You want to go?
Yeah, I think the reason why the challenge period got the most votes is that from a user perspective, when I'm using an optimistic rollup and I want to exit from it, I have to wait 7 days. So that's the reason that most people, I think, voted that. But if you were to ask a developer or the guy over here, or here, for example, the answer you would get is that after the batch has been set and all the data is available on Ethereum or the other L1, that's actual finality. So from that perspective, you could say that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. From the point of view of the user's action is not finalized until after the finalization period. But from the point of view of the protocol, the ordering of the transactions is finalized as soon as the data is made available and there's finality over that availability.
I think that brings up a really good point. I was having a discussion yesterday with a developer who was, basically we were kind of going back and forth about something, and he was like, from the developer's perspective, XYZ, but from the user's perspective, XYZ. And I think it brings up an interesting point when us as developers, right, we're building for users at the end of the day. So kind of my philosophy is we're building for users, so we want to do the thing that's best for users, that offers a superior experience for users, that clearly defines flows and things for users. Would you guys all agree with the philosophy if we were to come together and say, rollup finality should be defined from the perspective of the user, because at the end of the day, the people who will be using this are users and it's not developers. Is that something that you would agree with? And if not, why?
I need my nerd win points on the internet, so no.
I'm also going to say no, because I don't think the end users are actually going to care that much about the distinction between rollup finality versus DA finality versus these other things, right? This is even more in the range of like researchers in the field, right? More than even developers. And so, yeah, like at the end of the day, I hope users never have to think about this ever, and what they can do is like transfer from Scroll to Optimism, verify things with zk proofs, and like have trustless bridge. Like I want them to avoid this finality issue at all costs. But yeah.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, the user doesn't really care until something bad happens. So leaving it up in the user's hand, at least in most users' hand, is probably a bad idea. And you would rather leave it in the hands of people that actually know what they're doing in regards to building a rollup.
Yeah, like users, they don't care what's happening under the hood for Web 2 apps. They don't know all the tubes that all their information is going through. And it's all like abstracted away. So I think realistically, taking a point of view from a user, hopefully we can build nice abstractions where they don't need to care about finality. Everything is kind of hedged out in this system where infrastructure providers, they hedge out the risk for the users. Maybe there's some sort of like insurance. We can guarantee that users have good user experience. They don't need to care about gas. They don't need to care about any of that stuff. And it all just works.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting you guys say that because it's like the whole first half of this, we were going back and forth on like what's rollup finality, but then on my last question, you guys all kind of agree it's not relative to the user. It's right like it seems like there's actually some level of consensus on the stage for what rollup finality is, and maybe it's not a term that's as murky. Would you say that the reason it's murky is because maybe as an ecosystem, as like whatever you want to call it, we haven't, like the thing we really do need to agree on is relative to what, rather than what is the definition?
100%. I don't really see anyone really saying like what is the finality relative to in any of these debates.
I don't know that that's a great question to ask. That's maybe a spicy response, but like I think that we have to define it as the bridge's view of it. If we're saying that we're, as a whole off-chain protocol, relying on that bridge for the security, if we're inheriting it from Ethereum, like that's the whole reason we're here is we're building on Ethereum, we have to do it from the perspective of the bridge, which is going to be after a finalized proof or after the challenge window.
Well, that's still just a value judgment. Like you weigh the value of the bridge finality more than, say, the ordering of the transactions finality.
I mean, yes, right? Like I think the data availability finality, the ordering of those transactions is going to have to come before, right, the next level of finality, which I think should just be called rollup finality, I think. But yeah, and again, like at any point in this, in the timeline, we have this very transparent view that other people can look in there and say, like, I am like more sure than the atoms in the universe that we're going to be okay to make this transfer, whatever. But this is a technical term, right? Finality is a technical term, and so we need to keep it attached to the end of the process such that things have wrapped up. And if we can do that at the bridge, and the bridge is what we're inheriting our security from, and so we need to keep that kind of thing firm.
Well, I hope to fight you on Twitter about it one day.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it from the bridge, and that's what we're doing, if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have third parties sort of popping up and taking on that inventory risk. So at the end of the day, yeah, it is from the bridge perspective, and I do kind of agree here. Because if we're saying it's after each batch, whether that's 30 seconds, 2 minutes, or with a validity proof 3 or 10 hours, as it is now, we wouldn't get third parties taking that inventory risk to provide that withdrawal ability.
Okay, any final thoughts? We're nearing the end of our time here.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about optimistic rollups, my tiny shill for Scroll and zk rollups. Goal is for those proofs to be under 20 minutes because we have a big decentralized prover network, and alpha's on Gwirly, so if you're a dev, come say hello and build on Scroll.
All right, final words. I think that the definition of finality needs to be defined relative to something. And yeah, if you're interested at all in learning about optimistic rollups or want to talk about optimism, just come say hi after this.
I have nothing to shill, but I will. But
No, she'll feel.
But I will show fuel. Love fuel.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot. And yeah, we're all done.
Thank you for moderating, by the way.